It begins with the sound of marching boots. 1,000 footsteps echoing through the fog of history, steady, relentless, unbroken. You can almost hear the water rushing beside them, cold and endless, as if the land itself were testing their resolve. This is not just an army. It is an idea, moving through mountains, through hunger, through decades of struggle. From the frozen rivers of the Long March to the marble corridors of Beijing, power in China has always marched to its own rhythm. Each step, a revolution. Each silence, a purge. Each rise meant a price paid in blood. At the heart of this story stand two men, divided by time but bound by destiny. One built a nation from chaos. The other rebuilt its empire from the ashes of memory. Mao Zedong, the revolutionary who ruled with fire and fear. And Xi Jinping, the heir who turned exile into domination. Their paths never crossed, yet their shadows intertwine across the decades, in ideology, in ambition, and in the pursuit of absolute control. What began as a march of survival became a march of power, and today, that march continues. Not on muddy roads, but in the polished silence of the Great Hall, in the invisible algorithms of surveillance, in the heartbeat of a billion people who still walk in step with the party. This is the story of modern China, and it all begins with the sound of marching soldiers and the river that never stops flowing. It began long before Xi Jinping was born, before his name carried any weight, before China became a global power. The world was watching a nation torn apart by war and ideology. In the early 1930s, China was bleeding. A bitter civil war raged between two forces, the nationalist government of the Republic of China and a rising, radical group of communists led by a man named Mao Zedong. The communists were outnumbered, outgunned, and on the verge of annihilation. They had established a small stronghold in Jiangxi province, deep in the countryside, where Mao's Red Army tried to survive constant bombardment from nationalist troops. Hunger and disease swept through the camps. Soldiers starved while the nationalist army tightened its circle. It looked like the end of Mao's revolution. Then, in October of 1934, the communists made a desperate decision that would change history. Surrounded and running out of food, they decided to break through enemy lines and flee. Nearly 130,000 soldiers and civilians began a perilous retreat that would come to be known as the Long March. They attacked a weak point in the nationalist blockade and miraculously broke through. But what followed was a nightmare. Thousands died from exhaustion, starvation, and relentless attacks. Some deserted into the mountains. Others simply collapsed and never rose again. By the time the first 3 months had passed, less than half of the original marchers were still alive. Among those surviving in that chaos was a young communist official named Xi Zhongxun, a man whose fate would become forever tied to Mao's. At this point, Mao himself was not even the supreme commander of the Red Army. He had been sidelined, criticized for insisting on guerrilla tactics while other leaders favored direct confrontation. Yet it was those very confrontations that had nearly destroyed the army. At a small meeting point in the mountains of Guizhou province, one of Mao's old comrades, Zhou Enlai, made a fateful decision. He handed military command back to Mao. The exhausted troops needed direction, and Mao's unconventional strategies were their only hope. Under Mao's leadership, the Red Army turned away from open battle and plunged deep into the mountains, taking treacherous routes that the nationalist forces wouldn't dare follow. They crossed freezing rivers, climbed mountain passes higher than the clouds, and trudged through endless swamps. The marchers left behind the bodies of their dead comrades as markers along the trail. After nearly a year of suffering, the remnants of the Red Army, fewer than 8,000 from the original 130,000, finally reached northern Shanxi province. Waiting for them there was Xi Zhongxun, who had already established a small communist base in the region. He opened the doors of his local army and provided refuge to the survivors. That moment, when Mao's starving, frost-bitten men reached safety, was the end of the Long March, and the beginning of Mao's rise to absolute power. It was also the beginning of a bond that would later determine the destiny of Mao's greatest heir and his greatest rival, Xi Zhongxun's son. Xi Jinping Mao's reputation after the Long March was mythic. The retreat had been a disaster in military terms, but it had transformed into legend. Mao was portrayed as the man who had saved the revolution through sheer will and genius. His name became synonymous with survival, The Red Army was reborn as the People's Liberation Army, and Mao was elevated to the top of the party hierarchy. By 1935, he was the de facto leader of the Communist Party. By 1943, he was officially its head. With the party under his control, Mao began to craft a new kind of power, one based not on shared leadership, but on personal devotion. At the 1945 Party Congress, he introduced a resolution that declared Mao Zedong thought, his own political philosophy, as the guiding principle of the communist movement. From that moment on, Mao's ideas could not be questioned. To criticize him was to betray the revolution itself. Mao surrounded himself with a tight circle of loyalists, many of them veterans of the Long March. Zhou Enlai, Liu Shaoqi, Judah, all men who had marched and suffered beside him, became his lieutenants. And Shi Zhongxun, the young revolutionary who had given Mao refuge, rose quickly through the ranks. When Mao's revolution finally triumphed in 1949, and the nationalists fled to Taiwan, Shi Zhongxun stood among the honored founders of the new People's Republic of China. The new China that Mao declared from Tiananmen Square on October 1, 1949, was a country shattered by war and hunger but overflowing with revolutionary zeal. The Chinese people have stood up, Mao proclaimed as fireworks and parades filled Beijing. But victory was only the beginning. Running a country required something Mao had never truly valued: administration, expertise, and compromise. The Communist Party created a new government, the State Council, to manage the vast machinery of the new republic. Zhou Enlai, Mao's loyal lieutenant from the Long March, became the first premier of China. Shi Zhongxun, Mao's former ally in Shanxi, was appointed Secretary General of the State Council, a powerful role close to the center of government. In those early years, Mao ruled with both charisma and fear. The People's Republic was still fragile, and enemies, real or imagined, were everywhere. Landlords were executed, intellectuals silenced, and millions labeled as counter-revolutionaries. Yet within the inner circle, a sense of revolutionary brotherhood still existed. The Long March survivors, the so-called 8 Immortals, were bound by shared suffering. They believed their sacrifices had earned them the right to guide China's destiny. Among their children, a new generation grew up in privilege, the princelings. They attended elite schools in Beijing, lived in government compounds, and were told stories of how their fathers had saved China. Among them was Xi Jinping, born in 1953, the second son of Shi Zhongxun. Xi's early childhood was comfortable, almost idyllic. His father was one of the most respected revolutionary leaders, and the Xi family was part of Beijing's political elite. But behind the ceremonies and the slogans, Mao's regime was beginning to rot from within. By the late 1950s, Mao's policies had turned catastrophic. His ambitious plan to industrialize the countryside, the Great Leap Forward, led to one of the deadliest famines in human history. Tens of millions starved to death. The party tried to hide the scale of the disaster, but everyone inside the system knew. Discontent simmered even among Mao's own allies. Shi Zhongxun, known for his honesty and pragmatism, began to voice concerns. He believed in the revolution, but not in blind obedience. When he supported a reformist novel that Mao interpreted as an attack on his authority, Mao turned on him. The man who had once given Mao refuge was now branded a traitor. In 1962, Shi Zhongxun was purged. He lost his position, his prestige, and his freedom. His family was placed under surveillance. His teenage son, Xi Jinping, watched everything collapse: the security, the respect, the future that seemed guaranteed. 4 years later, in 1966, Mao launched a new campaign, the Cultural Revolution. Its goal was to eliminate bourgeois elements from society and restore Mao's ideological purity. In reality, it was a purge of anyone who could threaten his control. The Red Guards, militant students intoxicated with Maoist devotion, roamed the streets, attacking teachers, officials, and intellectuals. One day they came for Shi Zhongxun. Photographs from the time show him surrounded by young men in armbands, his head forced down, his arms pinned behind him as they shouted slogans. For 8 years he remained a prisoner, humiliated and beaten. His son, Xi Jinping, was expelled from his elite school, labeled the son of a counter-revolutionary, and sent to the countryside for re-education through labor. The once privileged princeling was reduced to a farmhand, living in a cave, working the fields with his bare hands. He hauled manure, carried stones, and slept on dirt floors. For the first time he felt what it meant to be powerless. And the man responsible for it all was Mao Zedong, the same man whose army his father had saved. That paradox would define the rest of Xi's life. When Mao died in 1976, the Cultural Revolution came to an abrupt end. The party was exhausted, traumatized, and desperate for stability. The revolutionary generation that had once marched behind Mao now saw the cost of their blind loyalty. They vowed never to let such chaos happen again, but before those reforms could take shape, the party had to reconcile with its own past, with Mao's victims, and with men like Xi Zhongxun. When Xi's father was finally released from prison, he was a broken man, but he was still loyal to the party. He didn't seek revenge. Instead, he believed that China could learn from its pain and reform itself from within. In those years, Xi Jinping returned to Beijing as a student. The boy who had been exiled to the countryside was now back in the capital, studying Marxist theory at Tsinghua University, the same ideology that had destroyed his youth. Many wondered why he joined the Communist Party after everything it had done to his family. But Xi understood something deeper. In China, power did not exist outside the party. To survive, you had to be inside it. The world around him was changing fast. A new leader was emerging from the ruins of Mao's revolution, a man named Deng Xiaoping. And it was Deng who would rewrite the rules of Chinese power, promising that never again would a single man rule over China unchecked. That, however, was only the beginning. Because one day, the boy who had shoveled dirt in the countryside would rise to the very top of that same party, and when he got there, he would make sure no one could ever take that power from him again. When Mao Zedong died in 1976, China was a country haunted by ghosts. Ghosts of famine, ghosts of violence, ghosts of betrayal. The nation had survived decades of revolution, but it had come at a terrible cost. Tens of millions of lives lost to ideology, ambition, and fear. For the Communist Party, Mao's death was not only the end of an era, it was an existential crisis. Everything in China's political life revolved around Mao, his image, his writings, his thought. Now the sun around which the system orbited had vanished, and no one knew what would come next. At first, there was confusion, even panic. Competing factions inside the Communist Party scrambled for power. On one side stood Mao's loyalists, including his wife, Jiang Qing, and her radical allies, known as the Gang of Four. On the other stood more pragmatic leaders, men who had been purged and rehabilitated multiple times, who had seen the damage Mao's extremism had caused. Among them was a small, pragmatic man with a sharp mind and a reputation for survival, Deng Xiaoping. Deng had been one of Mao's comrades during the revolution, even marching with him in the early years. But during the Cultural Revolution, he was branded a capitalist roader and sent into exile. Mao's death allowed him to return. Within months, the radicals were arrested, the Gang of Four tried and imprisoned, and Deng began to reassemble the government from the ashes. One of the first people he helped rehabilitate was Xi Zhongxun, the man who had once given Mao refuge during the Long March and later been destroyed by his paranoia. Deng had served with Xi decades earlier and trusted him deeply. To Deng, Xi symbolized the millions of loyal communists who had suffered unjustly under Mao's purges. Xi Zhongxun was released, reinstated, and eventually given senior positions again, this time far from Beijing's poisonous center of politics. He was appointed to lead the southern province of Guangdong, a region that would soon become the laboratory for China's new future. The party's priority now was survival. It needed to prevent another Mao, another all-powerful dictator who could drag the nation into chaos. Deng Xiaoping, though immensely powerful himself, understood that danger better than anyone. He had been on the receiving end of Mao's wrath and had watched friends die under his tyranny. In 1981, the party issued what became known as the Second Historical Resolution, a remarkable act of political self-correction. It declared that while Mao's contributions to the revolution were undeniable, his later years were marked by serious mistakes, especially the Cultural Revolution. It condemned the excesses of one-man rule and emphasized the need for collective leadership, a system in which no single leader could ever again dominate. The party, the way Mao had, the resolution, was both an admission of guilt and a roadmap for the future. It preserved Mao's legacy as the founder of the nation, while promising that his kind of absolute power would never return. For ordinary Chinese, Deng's leadership meant something different, a loosening of the iron grip that had defined their lives. He famously declared, "It doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." It was a simple metaphor, one that signaled the dawn of economic pragmatism. Deng opened China's doors to foreign trade, invited investment, and encouraged local experimentation. In the late 1970s and 1980s, factories began to hum again. Farmers were allowed to sell surplus crops. Entrepreneurs began to emerge. And the first signs of capitalism crept into a society still calling itself socialist. For Xi Jinping, this was a moment of redemption. As governor of Guangdong, he helped establish China's first special economic zone in Shenzhen, a small fishing village that would later become one of the world's largest cities. His province became the symbol of Deng's reforms, a place where the future of China was being written in steel, concrete, and neon lights. Meanwhile, his son, Xi Jinping, was rebuilding his own life. The boy who had shoveled dirt and lived in a cave during the Cultural Revolution had returned to Beijing, studying Marxist theory at Tsinghua University. His classmates remembered him as quiet, disciplined, and unusually cautious, someone who never spoke too freely, who listened more than he talked. He understood that survival in the party meant patience. Xi joined the Communist Party in 1974, during the dying years of Mao's rule, and by the late 1970s, he was working as an aide to military leaders. He watched carefully as Deng reshaped China, not through revolutionary passion, but through cold, deliberate reform for young cadres like Xi. The message was clear. Ideology was still important, but loyalty was everything. And the true center of power remained the party, not the government, not the people. While the rest of the world marveled at China's economic awakening, inside the party, the system of power had taken on a new shape. The Politburo Standing Committee, a small group of the most senior leaders, would now make all the crucial decisions. Beneath them, the State Council would manage daily governance. In theory, this was collective leadership. In practice, Deng Xiaoping still called the shots, even though he never became president or general secretary. He ruled from behind the curtain, guiding China's direction while avoiding the appearance of a dictator. It was a delicate balance, one that allowed economic growth while keeping political control firmly in the party's hands. But the balance was fragile. As China's cities began to modernize, its citizens began to hope for more than material comfort. Students, intellectuals, and reformers started demanding political openness, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to criticize the party. By the spring of 1989, those hopes erupted into a movement. Tens of thousands of students gathered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, calling for democracy and an end to corruption. They built statues of liberty, held hunger strikes, and sang revolutionary songs that now took on a bitter irony. At first, the party was divided. Some leaders wanted negotiation. Others demanded force. Deng Xiaoping, now aging but still powerful, made the fateful decision. The army would move in. On the night of June 3, 1989, tanks rolled into Tiananmen Square. Soldiers opened fire. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, were killed. The world watched in horror as the symbol of China's new openness drowned in blood. The massacre shocked the party's younger generation. For Xi Jinping, it was a lesson carved in steel. Deng's reforms had transformed China's economy, but political reform would never follow. The party would tolerate no threat to its authority. Not from students, not from citizens, not even from its own members. After the crackdown, China turned inward again. Foreign sanctions followed, but the economic engine Deng had built kept roaring. In the 1990s, the country's growth became unstoppable. Factories, highways, skyscrapers rising in every direction. Poverty rates plummeted. A new middle class emerged, and within the party, a new type of leader was being trained. Technocrats, engineers, administrators, and economists who managed the machinery of China's rise. It was no longer about revolution or ideology. It was about results. Xi Jinping was one of them. He had begun his political career far from Beijing, in Hebei province, a rural region outside the capital. There he proved himself as a competent, loyal party secretary. His work caught attention, and soon he was sent further south, to Fujian, a coastal province facing Taiwan, heavily influenced by the military. In Fujian, Xi spent more than a decade. He handled local corruption cases, strengthened ties with the army, and earned a reputation as a reliable functionary. He wasn't flashy. He didn't seek media attention, but his discipline impressed superiors. It was during this time that he quietly built a network of military allies, generals and officers who respected his father's revolutionary legacy and saw in him a bridge between the old guard and the new. Technocrats. By the early 2000s, China had a new generation of leaders at the top, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, men who represented the stable, collective leadership model Deng had envisioned. Power was shared, term limits enforced, and economic growth prioritized above all else. To the outside world, China appeared to have achieved the perfect balance, prosperity without political instability. But beneath the surface, a different kind of tension was growing. Rapid growth had made China richer, but it had also made it corrupt. Local officials hoarded wealth, businesses bribed bureaucrats, and inequality exploded. The party's moral authority, the revolutionary purity that Mao had once used to justify his rule, was fading fast. Xi Jinping, meanwhile, was still climbing. After Fujian, he moved to Zhejiang, another prosperous coastal province. There, he built relationships with business leaders and promoted economic innovation. He became known for his ability to present himself as both modern and orthodox, a reformer in economics, but a hardliner in party loyalty. He avoided scandals, rarely spoke out, and never revealed his ambitions. But those who worked with him noticed something deeper, an intense awareness of hierarchy, of control, of how fragile power could be. In 2007, as China's booming economy continued to dazzle the world, a corruption scandal erupted in Shanghai, one of the country's richest cities. The local party chief was removed, and Beijing needed someone trustworthy to clean up the mess. The choice was Xi Jinping. His brief tenure in Shanghai, just 7 months, was decisive. He restored order, avoided public criticism, and earned a reputation for obedience. He was exactly the kind of man the party's top leadership wanted: experienced, loyal, and, they believed, safe. That same year, at the 17th Party Congress, Xi was promoted to the Politburo Standing Committee, the small elite group of 7 to 9 men who governed China. It was the highest circle of power. After years in the political wilderness, the son of the purged revolutionary had finally reached the summit his father once dreamed of. For the party elders who selected him, Xi seemed like the perfect candidate to ensure stability. He was a princeling, the son of a respected Long March hero, but he didn't seem power-hungry. His long years in the provinces made him appear humble and pragmatic. He had the pedigree of a revolutionary but the demeanor of a bureaucrat. When Hu Jintao, the general secretary at the time, prepared to step down, Xi Jinping was quietly chosen as his successor. The leadership transition would take place in 2012, and it was meant to symbolize the strength of Deng's collective model, a peaceful, predictable transfer of power within the party's rules. But Xi had learned something from both Mao and Deng. Rules are only as strong as the men who enforce them. He had seen his father rise and fall under Mao's tyranny. He had watched Deng build a system designed to prevent another dictator. But he also knew how easily that system could be dismantled from the inside. By the time the party unveiled its new leadership lineup in November 2012, Xi Jinping stood at the front of the stage. The new general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, the new head of the military, and soon, the president of the People's Republic of China. The smiling technocrat who had spent years in the shadows was suddenly the most powerful man in the country. But behind that calm exterior, Xi carried the lessons of exile, humiliation, and survival. He had seen what unchecked power could do. He had seen what losing it felt like, and in his mind, the two were inseparable. Over the next few years, he would launch one of the most sweeping campaigns in modern Chinese history, a campaign that would begin with a promise to root out corruption, and end with Xi Jinping standing alone at the center of Chinese power, unchallenged, unstoppable, and to many, untouchable. The fire that had once burned his family would soon become the fire through which he forged his own empire. When Xi Jinping took power in 2012, China was at the height of its global rise. Its economy had become the second largest in the world. Its cities glowed with skyscrapers and neon, and its military strength was growing with quiet confidence. The party celebrated this prosperity as proof that its system worked. One-party rule with Chinese characteristics, the harmony of order and progress. But behind the facade of success, the party's foundation was rotting. Corruption had become endemic. From small county offices to the highest ministries, bribes and secret deals were a way of life. Party officials lived in luxury villas. Their children studied abroad, and their loyalty was measured not in ideology but in profit. Ordinary citizens could see it. So could Xi Jinping. In his first speech as General Secretary, he warned that corruption threatened the party's survival. "If we do not handle it properly," he said, "it could prove fatal." Those words carried a tone that many in the audience recognized, calm, deliberate but edged with steel. To most observers, Xi seemed like the continuation of collective leadership, another cautious bureaucrat who would preserve the status quo. But within months, he began to move in ways no one expected. He launched a campaign that would change the face of the party and reshape China's political system for a generation. It was called the Anti-Corruption Campaign, but its scope was far greater than its name suggested. The campaign began quietly in early 2013. Investigations appeared in local newspapers about mid-level officials taking bribes. Then came televised trials, public confessions, and dismissals. Xi's new slogan spread like wildfire: "Hunt tigers and swat flies." Tigers were high-ranking officials. Flies were the small ones, the petty bureaucrats. No one would be safe. At first, the public cheered. For decades, people had watched the powerful act with impunity. Now they saw them fall. But behind the scenes, the campaign was also dismantling the delicate network of loyalties that had held collective leadership together. Xi's first major target was Zhou Yongkang, China's former security chief, one of the most powerful men in the party, and a member of the previous Politburo Standing Committee. Zhou controlled the police, the courts, and the intelligence services, the machinery of fear itself. For decades, no one in his position had ever been investigated. In 2014, state media announced that Zhou was under investigation for serious disciplinary violations. A year later, he was sentenced to life in prison. His empire of loyal officials was purged, and Xi had effectively seized control of the entire domestic security apparatus. The message was unmistakable. If a former standing committee member could fall, anyone could. Soon the campaign expanded. Generals, ministers, provincial governors, CEOs of state enterprises, hundreds of them vanished overnight into detention centers known as shuanggui. Some reappeared in court. Others never did. By 2016, over 1 million officials had been investigated. Xi filled their empty seats with people he trusted, men who had served with him in Fujian, Zhejiang, and Shanghai. They were known as the Xi clique, and their loyalty was personal. At the same time, Xi began to tighten his grip on the military. He chaired the Central Military Commission, the same institution that had once been Mao's power base. He ordered sweeping reforms, reorganizing the army, removing senior officers, and demanding absolute loyalty to the chairman of the commission, meaning himself. Generals who had grown rich on kickbacks were stripped of rank, while new officers rose who owed everything to Xi. By 2017, the People's Liberation Army was no longer the party's army. It was Xi's, but Xi's ambition extended far beyond anti-corruption. He wanted to rebuild the party's soul. He believed that China's success had made its leaders complacent, that they had forgotten the revolutionary purpose that once gave the party legitimacy. He wanted to create unity, not through democracy, but through faith. Faith in the party, faith in himself, and faith in the idea of a strong, rejuvenated China. To achieve that, he resurrected the language of Mao. He called for a Chinese dream, the dream of national rejuvenation, of returning China to its rightful place as a great civilization. He spoke of discipline, struggle, and purity. Party members were required to study his speeches, memorize slogans, and attend political education sessions reminiscent of the Mao era. In 2017, Xi introduced a new political doctrine. Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. The title alone was a statement. It placed his ideology on the same pedestal as Mao Zedong thought and Deng Xiaoping theory. And soon it was written into the Chinese constitution. Xi's words were now law. Externally, China under Xi became more assertive. The country poured money into the Belt and Road Initiative, a vast network of trade routes and infrastructure projects connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe. It was both an economic plan and a geopolitical strategy, expanding China's influence across continents. In the South China Sea, Chinese ships built artificial islands claiming vast stretches of ocean and defying international rulings. In Hong Kong, the promise of one country, two systems began to erode as Beijing imposed new laws restricting dissent. In Xinjiang, the government launched a massive security crackdown on Uyghur Muslims, building what human rights groups called re-education camps. Inside China, surveillance cameras multiplied, facial recognition systems spread, and censorship became more sophisticated than ever before. The internet, once a space of limited freedom, turned into a digital fortress. Xi declared that the party leads everything, and meant it literally. While the outside world debated China's growing power, Xi was remaking its political structure from within. At the 19th Party Congress in 2017, he unveiled a new Politburo Standing Committee. Of its 7 members, at least 4 had long personal ties to him. Together, they represented the most unified leadership in decades, unified not by consensus, but by loyalty to one man. Traditionally, each Chinese leader served 2 5-year terms, then stepped down. It was a rule set in place after Mao's death, designed to prevent the return of dictatorship. But Xi never intended to leave. In 2018, the National People's Congress, China's rubber stamp legislature, voted to abolish the presidential term limit. The vote was 2,958 to 2, only 2 opposed. With that, the last institutional check on Xi's power vanished. He could now rule indefinitely. Foreign observers compared him to Mao. State media compared him to a wise father. But within the party, many saw the truth. Collective leadership was over. China had a supreme leader again. For Xi, this wasn't just about power. It was about destiny. He saw himself as the man chosen to restore China's greatness, to complete the mission that Mao began and Deng interrupted. He often invoked history, quoting ancient poets and military strategists. He spoke of humiliation, the century of shame when foreign powers carved up China, and promised that under his watch, such humiliation would never return. This message resonated deeply with the public. After decades of rapid modernization, many Chinese citizens felt pride mixed with anxiety. Pride in their nation's success, but anxiety about its identity. Xi offered certainty. The party would lead, China would rise, and order would be maintained. And for a time, it worked. Between 2012 and 2020, China's economy doubled in size. Hundreds of millions escaped poverty. Military spending soared. Xi's face appeared on billboards, posters, even mobile apps. Students were required to study his speeches in school. His image was everywhere, smiling, confident, paternal. Yet, as the cult of Xi grew, so did the silence around him. No one dared criticize the chairman. Even former leaders, men like Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, faded into symbolic roles, their allies quietly removed. The system Deng had built to prevent absolute power was now a memory. In 2020, Xi faced the first major crisis of his rule, the COVID-19 pandemic. The virus emerged in Wuhan, spreading rapidly across China and then the world. Xi's government imposed draconian lockdowns, sealing entire cities, deploying drones, and enforcing quarantines with military precision. The strategy, called Zero COVID, became a point of pride. Proof, Xi said, that China's system was superior to the West's. For a while, the numbers supported him. While other countries struggled, China seemed to contain the virus. But the cost was immense. Shuttered businesses, lost jobs, families separated, and a surveillance state more intrusive than ever. By 2022, frustration was boiling over. In dozens of cities, citizens began to protest, a rare, dangerous act in Xi's China. They held up blank sheets of paper, a silent symbol of all they could not say. They called for freedom. Some even whispered the unthinkable. Down with Xi Jinping. It was the largest wave of dissent since Tiananmen Square. For the first time in a decade, Xi's authority trembled. The party responded with speed and calculation. Within weeks, the zero-COVID policy was abandoned. Restrictions disappeared almost overnight. The protests stopped, but the economy, already slowing, continued to weaken. For many Chinese, the myth of Xi's infallibility cracked, but it did not break. Just weeks before those protests, in October 2022, Xi had secured his third term as General Secretary at the 20th Party Congress. It was a moment of political theater, the kind of choreography the party had perfected. One by one, the members of the new standing committee walked onto the stage at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. As cameras flashed, Xi appeared first. That order of appearance was no coincidence. It meant he would rule for another 5 years, perhaps for life. The men who followed him were all loyalists. Gone were the protégés of his predecessors. Even Hu Jintao, the former president, was escorted out of the hall mid-ceremony in a scene that shocked the world. No explanation was given. The symbolism was unmistakable. The old era was over. At that moment, Xi stood alone at the top of the world's most populous nation, the culmination of a journey that had begun half a century earlier, when a humiliated teenager had been sent to the countryside to dig ditches. Now, that same man controlled the party, the government, and the military, every lever of power Mao had once held. In private speeches to party cadres, Xi often warns of black swans and gray rhinos, unpredictable crises that could threaten the regime. He knows that history is full of emperors who believed their rule would last forever, but he also believes he is different. He has studied the fall of the Soviet Union, the Arab Spring, and the color revolutions that toppled dictators elsewhere. His conclusion is always the same: the party must never loosen its grip. And so, the surveillance continues. The purges continue. The cult of personality continues. Whether Xi's rule will endure for decades or collapse under its own weight, no one can say. But for now, he has achieved what few leaders in modern history have: total control over a fifth of humanity. From Mao's mountains to the skyscrapers of Beijing, from the Long March to the Great Firewall, the story has come full circle. The child of the purged revolutionary now presides over the most powerful autocracy on earth. He once said, "Power must be caged by regulations." But in Xi's China, the cage is gone, and the tiger that remains is his alone. In modern China, the story of power has always been cyclical. Revolution gives birth to order, order hardens into control, and control, when left unchecked, becomes the very tyranny it once sought to destroy. From Mao's chaotic revolution to Deng's pragmatic reform, to Xi Jinping's quiet but relentless consolidation, the cycle has spun again. Now, under Xi, China has entered a new chapter, one defined by ambition, nationalism, and surveillance on a scale that Mao himself could never have imagined. When Xi walked onto the stage of the Great Hall of the People in October 2022 to announce his third term as General Secretary, it was more than a political ceremony. It was a coronation. Behind him stood 6 men, all of whom owed their positions to him alone. In front of him sat nearly 3,000 delegates, hand-picked and loyal. And beyond them, 1.4 billion citizens, most of whom had never voted in an election. The applause was thunderous, the choreography perfect. But the true message was silent. The age of collective leadership was over. China had a new chairman. Xi Jinping's rule has entered what some call the era of permanence. He no longer has rivals, only subordinates. Within the party, every speech, every policy, every new direction must begin with one phrase: under the guidance of Xi Jinping thought. His ideology has become the lens through which China sees itself. But Xi's vision is not merely domestic. He believes China's rise is inevitable, that the world is entering a post-Western age in which the Chinese model of governance, discipline, and centralized control will prevail. To him, the party is not a relic of the past. It is the embodiment of China's continuity. He often quotes ancient philosophy, Confucius, Sun Tzu, the Tang poets, presenting himself as a scholar warrior, a man who blends history with destiny. His speeches are heavy with words like rejuvenation, harmony, and stability. But beneath those words lies a harder truth. Xi's China is built on fear as much as faith. After securing his third term, Xi began to tighten ideological control even further. Universities received new directives. All courses, from economics to physics, must incorporate Xi Jinping thought. Teachers were warned against Western liberal values. Books vanished from libraries. Online discussions disappeared overnight. The party reintroduced mandatory study sessions, now hosted through a mobile app called Study Xi, Strengthen China. Millions of users log in daily to read his speeches, take ideological quizzes, and earn loyalty points. In Mao's era, people carried the little red book. In Xi's era, they carry the little red app. Propaganda has become seamless, woven into every layer of daily life. State media praises Xi's leadership in glowing language, describing him as the people's leader, helmsman, even the heart of the party. Children in schools recite oaths to love their country, their party, and their chairman. Portraits of Xi hang beside the national flag in classrooms. To outsiders, this may seem like a return to Mao-style cult of personality. Inside China, it is accepted as normal, even reassuring. For many citizens, Xi represents order after chaos, certainty after corruption, strength after weakness. But maintaining that image requires control, and control requires surveillance. Under Xi, China has constructed one of the most sophisticated digital monitoring systems in the world. Hundreds of millions of cameras line the streets, equipped with facial recognition. Smartphones track user locations and browsing history. Artificial intelligence predicts suspicious behavior. In cities like Shenzhen and Chengdu, a social credit system scores citizens on their actions, whether they pay bills on time, obey traffic rules, or criticize the government online. Those with high scores receive privileges. Those with low scores can lose access to loans, travel, or even jobs. Officially, it is presented as a system of trustworthiness. Unofficially, it is a tool of obedience. Dissent, even mild, is dangerous. Journalists vanish. Lawyers who defend political prisoners are disbarred. Celebrities who speak out are erased from the internet as if they never existed. The Great Firewall, China's vast online censorship system, has become not only a digital barrier, but a psychological one. Most Chinese citizens live their online lives entirely within it, consuming only the information that the party approves. Yet beneath this control, Xi faces growing challenges. Economically, China's miracle has slowed. The decades of double-digit growth that defined Deng's reforms are gone. Debt has ballooned. The real estate bubble has burst. The population is aging, the workforce shrinking. Unemployment among the young is at record levels, forcing the government to simply stop reporting the number. For a leader who built his legitimacy on prosperity and strength, economic stagnation is dangerous. It threatens the unspoken bargain between the party and the people. You stay silent, and we deliver progress. To offset this, Xi has turned outward, using nationalism as both a shield and a weapon. He presents China as a nation encircled by hostile powers, constantly tested by foreign interference. The message is clear. Unity behind the party is essential for survival. Taiwan has become the centerpiece of that message. Xi calls reunification a historical mission that must be fulfilled. Chinese warplanes regularly cross into Taiwan's air defense zone. Warships circle the island. Military exercises rehearse invasion scenarios. To many observers, Xi's ambitions extend beyond Taiwan. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has poured trillions of dollars into infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Ports, railways, power plants. These projects expand China's influence while tying other nations to its economic orbit. Critics call it debt diplomacy. Xi calls it win-win cooperation. Meanwhile, China's military, the People's Liberation Army, has modernized at astonishing speed. New aircraft carriers, stealth jets, and hypersonic missiles showcase a force ready to challenge the United States in the Pacific. Xi often visits military bases in his olive green jacket, addressing soldiers as comrades of the new Long March. He reminds them that the party commands the gun, echoing Mao's words almost a century later. But every empire, even a digital one, carries contradictions. Xi's China is both strong and fragile, outwardly united, inwardly anxious. The 2022 protests against COVID lockdowns exposed cracks in the system that propaganda could not conceal. People dared to shout Xi's name in anger, and though the protests faded, they left a scar. Since then, the party has struggled to restore confidence. Youth unemployment, slowing exports, and declining foreign investment have all raised uncomfortable questions about the future. At the same time, China's diplomatic stance has hardened. Relations with the United States have deteriorated to their lowest point in decades. Trade wars, technology bans, and military tensions in the South China Sea have replaced cooperation with rivalry. Xi frames this confrontation as inevitable, the natural clash between a declining West and a rising East. In speeches, he warns against foreign forces that seek to contain China. He presents the party's control not as oppression, but as protection. The message resonates deeply with a population proud of its nation's resurgence after a century of humiliation. But there are those, quietly, who wonder what happens when strength becomes isolation, when security becomes paranoia. Inside the party, Xi has dismantled the informal norms that once guaranteed balance. Term limits are gone. Age limits for retirement are ignored. Successors are nowhere to be seen. Every major position, from the security services to the economy, from propaganda to the military, is held by someone personally loyal to him. The result is stability, but it is a brittle stability. In private, some officials whisper that no one dares speak the truth to Xi. Policy mistakes go unchallenged. During the COVID lockdowns, local governments competed to show loyalty by enforcing extreme restrictions, leading to humanitarian crises. Yet even as resentment grew, no one took responsibility, because in Xi's system, all decisions flow upward, and all mistakes vanish downward. Historians have seen this pattern before. The longer a leader centralizes power, the more he depends on fear to maintain it. And fear, though effective, breeds silence, and silence blinds. Still, Xi continues to present himself as the embodiment of China's destiny. In 2021, the party issued its third historical resolution, only the third in its 100-year history. The first in 1945 had enshrined Mao Zedong as supreme leader. The second, in 1981, had limited the power of any future leader. The third did the opposite. It declared Xi Jinping's leadership as the core of the party, and his ideology as the guiding principle of the nation. With that, history itself was rewritten. Mao founded China. Tongue made it rich. Xi would make it powerful. In the years since, that narrative has become doctrine. Museums now dedicate sections to Xi's achievements. Documentaries celebrate his childhood, his years of hardship, his love for the people. Even the old revolutionary sites from the Long March have been repurposed into Xi-era pilgrimage trails. Visitors can stand in the same caves where young Xi once lived during his exile, now preserved as sacred sites of perseverance. To his followers, Xi represents resilience. To his critics, he represents regression. But to most Chinese, he is simply the reality of power, the face that defines their times. As of today, Xi holds all three of the most important titles in China: General Secretary of the Communist Party, President of the People's Republic, and Chairman of the Central Military Commission. He controls the party, the state, and the army, the same trinity that made Mao untouchable. And yet, Xi's rule differs in one crucial way. Mao ruled through chaos. Xi rules through order. Where Mao unleashed revolution, Xi enforces discipline. His dictatorship is not wild but methodical, a system of obedience built on algorithms, cameras, and laws. If Mao's power came from fear of the Red Guards, Xi's comes from the quiet hum of surveillance drones. Outside China, the world watches with fascination and unease. Some see Xi's rise as the inevitable reassertion of Chinese greatness. Others see it as the dawn of a new authoritarian century. Western democracies have begun to decouple their economies, restrict Chinese technology, and strengthen alliances across the Pacific. Beijing, in turn, denounces these moves as containment, proof that the world fears China's success. Amid this tension, Xi continues to speak of peace, but on China's terms. He promotes an alternative vision of global order, one where sovereignty outweighs human rights and stability outweighs freedom. Through international forums, loans, and investments, Beijing's influence reaches deep into Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. To many developing nations, China under Xi offers an appealing promise: prosperity without democracy, growth without dissent. It is, in essence, a model of control that travels well, and yet history offers no permanent empires. Even the most powerful systems depend on the fragile faith of those who live within them. Xi understands this. He knows that fear can rule a nation but not inspire it forever. That is why his propaganda speaks not of dictatorship, but of destiny. He presents himself not as a ruler, but as a custodian of China's renewal, the man chosen by history to complete the long journey from humiliation to greatness. In private moments, those who have met him describe him as disciplined, unsmiling, methodical, a man who measures every word. He rarely shows emotion, rarely improvises. He is not a dreamer like Mao, nor a reformer like Deng. He is a survivor. And for a survivor, permanence is the ultimate victory. As Xi enters his second decade in power, there are no signs he intends to step down. His age 72 is no barrier. His influence spans the military, the economy, and ideology. He has become the axis around which modern China turns. But the same question that haunted Mao now hovers over Xi. What happens when everything depends on one man? The cycle of Chinese power, revolution, reform, control, has come full circle. Mao once tore down the old order to build his vision of equality. Deng dismantled Mao's chaos to build prosperity. Xi has dismantled Deng's openness to build control. Each believed he was saving China from the mistakes of the last. And perhaps, in their own way, each did. Today, as the red flag flies over Tiananmen Square, the slogans have changed, but the rhythm remains the same. Every morning, state television opens with patriotic anthems and news of the chairman's latest directives. Every evening, factories, offices, and schools echo with the same message. China's future is bright, its leadership wise, its destiny unstoppable. In a nation where history is rewritten by the victors, Xi Jinping stands as both author and subject, the ruler who rose from the ruins of Mao's revolution to forge a new kind of autocracy, one that merges ideology with technology, surveillance with faith, obedience with pride. For now, his power seems absolute. But history, like the Great Wall, stretches far beyond the reach of any single man. Someday, another leader will rise, another cycle will begin, and the story will be told again of a nation forever balancing between glory and fear, and of the men who believe they were born to lead it. Until then, Xi Jinping remains what he has always sought to be, the man at the center of the storm, the heir to Mao's revolution and the new chairman of China.